Hello and welcome to a new video. My name is Elena and I live in Scotland. Usually I do outdoorsy type of videos, but while we are waiting for the weather to be a lot more consistent, I want to do another talking video where I basically talk about my life experience. In the case of this video, I wanted to touch on the topic of being a highly sensitive person more in depth, because I already mentioned it in my video about being an INFJ. What is a highly sensitive person, short HSP, you may ask? For the most part, these are people who have a heightened sense of perception, for example, towards noises, smells, sensations, but also feelings and emotions. They may get overwhelmed easily by these things and may feel the need to withdraw into solitude to recuperate and recenter. I found a checklist online which is by no means comprehensive, but I'll put it in the description for you in case you want to check yourself. And you don't need to be all of the things on the list, but it's a start if you already feel like you're some of the things. I don't quite remember where I came across the concept for the first time, but it rang true. But then last year I came across a German channel dedicated to the topic of HSP called Sandra Quedenbaum Hochsensibilität. And if you're a German speaker, I would definitely recommend this channel to you. But she had a list of things that I never even heard of, and I never even imagined that this could be linked to being highly sensitive. One example is hating the feeling of wool on your skin because it's really itchy. Even this woolen jumper, I'm having to wear a cotton thing underneath just to keep it away directly from my skin. And this is something that I was really sensitive to as a child, and I hated wearing the sweaters that my grandma knitted for me. Of course, it was a lovely gesture, but they felt so uncomfortable. Or even the sensation of rubbing wet fabric or cotton against each other. Like if you have a cotton bud and you sort of rub it, and it's the sensation that it makes, and I hate even thinking about it because it gives me shivers. And that's such a strange thing that I never heard before, apart from that particular video that she made with a reasonably long list of different qualities. I think the first time somebody pointed out to me that I was maybe more sensitive than other people was my primary school teacher in my first year of primary school. I pointed out to her that I was able to smell something, and then she said to me that I had the nose of a deer. And that gave me the impression I had a rather sensitive sense of smell. And of course, I still can react strongly to scents and to smells. Something I can have trouble with is the smell of cigarettes. And there was one time where we were on a bus and somebody behind me had a very intense breath that smelled of cigarette. And in hindsight, maybe I should have switched the seat, but in combination with the bus, it really made me feel nauseous. And I can definitely appreciate the fact that a lot of people vape nowadays, just because it smells so much nicer. I don't really care if you smoke or not, but for the sake of my own nose, I would probably ask you to smoke in another room or outside. I'm usually quite aware of all the scents around me, but I don't necessarily avoid them. I do like to smell things. I like to smell perfumes as long as they're not too strong. And then another sensitivity would be taste. And in particular for me, it's bitter tastes. Apparently there is something called a super taster. And this is a person who has more papilla on their tongue than the average person. And this is the reason why they can perceive bitter tastes way more intensely. And this is definitely the case for me, though I have to say that I did get used to certain bitter tastes over time. I used to really hate them when I was a child. I even hated spinach, which is only slightly bitter. Nowadays I prefer chocolate, which is 90%. But back in the day when I was a child, I really didn't like any kind of dark chocolate. When I tried coffee for the first time, I also hated it because it was so awfully bitter, and I always drank coffee with sugar and milk because I like the flavor of coffee, but I had to mask the bitterness quite strongly. And what I tended to do was to water it down to the consistency of tea almost. And speaking of tea, black and green tea is also something that I tend to perceive as very bitter. And I tend to add some kind of dairy to it. Although nowadays I try to abstain from sugar as much as I can, and I just use the dairy. When I first tried beer, it was horribly bitter, and I really had to get used to it. And still, I was preferring sweet tasting white beer over hoppy types of beer. And nowadays, I don't really drink beer anymore at all. Grapefruit was another thing that was highly disappointing. I love citrus fruits, but when I tried grapefruit, I just couldn't enjoy it at all because it was just too bitter. And my mother would always drink coffee, and she would drink it black as well, and I always wondered how she was doing that. And in my head I concocted the theory that she must have just burned her tongue, and that her tongue wasn't actually able to taste the coffee properly. But it's possible that she simply does not taste the bitterness of the coffee, or she's gotten so used to it that it doesn't really matter anymore. Now, bright colours is something I can deal with pretty well. I like bright colours, in fact. Bright lights, it depends. Artificially bright lights, they're not so bad, but I'm sitting here in the sun and you might think nothing of it, but this is actually really intense for me, and it's a little bit uncomfortable. And I've always had this from when I was young, when the bright sun was out and it was shining on the top of my head. After a few hours I would get a headache, basically. And even now, the sun shining on my scalp from between 1 to 5 minutes creates this really, really warm sensation, and I feel the need to kind of like shield and protect myself. And this is why I wear a hat most of the time. And I love my hat because it really is great from protecting both my head and my eyes. And speaking of my eyes, I did have a laser eye surgery, and after that I became a little more sensitive towards looking at bright light as well. So if I try to look into the sun, my eyes are definitely feeling very sensitive to that. And I kind of prefer a hat over sunglasses because I can still see all the colours really well, but it also protects my head at the same time. I might just be taking my hat on and off periodically because the sun keeps coming in and out. So now the thing that I'm hands down the most sensitive to, and that is noises. I simply cannot be around people who shout. If I walk along the street and somebody's shouting, I'm gonna cross the road. If you're shouting at me, I'm just gonna leave. It kind of works like this. Or, well, I will tell you to stop shouting at me, but if you don't, I'm gonna leave. I even have to ask my partner to adjust his volume of speaking, because while he's not shouting, he's projecting with his voice, and even that can be too much at times. I was shouted at as a child when I did something wrong, so that is probably something to do with that. I took it really, really to heart, and I took it really badly, probably because I was sensitive to that. And so I wouldn't quite call it PTSD, but I can have quite visceral reactions to shouting. And this is also the one thing that is the most likely to overwhelm me and make me shut down compared to smells or lights. So the way I would describe it is an information overload that happens. So my brain takes in information at all times, so it's sort of like a background scanning, and I perceive all the different things. But when I get stressed, for example, then the brain kind of switches, and it's probably something to do with fight or flight mode, because then the brain just starts perceiving absolutely everything, and I have no possibility to shout out what's going on around me. And the only way to interrupt this is just to sever the connection with any kind of noise that is unwanted. And the best thing to do would obviously to go into a room by myself or out in the woods and just have, natural sounds or silence. But if I can't do that, if I have to be around people, and if I can't get away, I like to listen to loud music. And you'd be surprised how great metal music is for this kind of thing, because if I'm listening to something voluntarily, if I choose to listen to it, then it doesn't really matter how loud it is. I've got one example. There was one time when I still lived in Edinburgh, we were walking to see the fireworks, and for some reason I got stressed, and there was a group of people behind me, and there came a point where I couldn't shut out the voices. One of the voices was quite sort of piercing as well, and it's so strange to suffer from having to listen to somebody else speak. But it got so bad, I think eventually I put the iPod on and I just listened to music because I couldn't handle it any longer. And I used to listen to music all the time, walking around the city. It was, at the time I thought it was really great because it's almost like having your own soundtrack to your life. You're walking around and just like music is playing. But eventually I stopped doing that just because I wanted to be more present, to be able to listen to sounds. Even when I used to walk in the forest, I would listen to music. When I was, in my early 20s. Or in my teens. And nowadays I just enjoy the noises that are around me. And I may have mentioned that in my INFJ video, but there was a Christmas gathering that I went to with my partner, and it was at his family's house. And there came a point where again I became stressed and the switch flipped. And I was not able to shout out anybody's conversation, so there was little groups having different conversations, and I was trying to read a book and I just was not able to keep this out of my head, and I wasn't able to concentrate. So eventually I had to just get up and leave and sit in a room by myself for a while. Unfortunately, that also means that I'm not doing too well with neighbours or roommates. When I came back to Edinburgh to live with my partner, we also had another roommate who was a friend from our society. And even though I liked this person, part of me knew that I was going to become resentful purely from having to live with somebody else. And that is just because this person was making noises. Of course, they are entitled to living their own life, playing music, doing whatever they want. But for me, it meant that I wasn't able to control the noise levels around me. And I was also working a stressful job at the time, and that really was unpleasant at the time. And I frequently had to listen to loud music just to take myself out of it. And I kind of felt like my freedom was restricted because I was forced to listen to music to be able to cope with it at the time. So that is sort of my rule of thumb, not to live with anybody else. And miraculously, my partner can be around me 24/7 and it doesn't really make me feel drained or anything like that. I love hanging out with friends, but I would never want to live with any of them because once again that would make me feel overwhelmed, and I want to have great relationships with my friends. So nowadays I'm way more relaxed than I used to be, and I don't get overwhelmed quite as often. I think when I do get overwhelmed, it's because maybe I'm researching something and I've taken in too much information, because it doesn't just have to be noise, it can just be any kinds of stimuli, which include just like reading things and overloading my brain. And even if our neighbors are playing loud music, I can just shake it off unless I'm really, really stressed. Or if I had a ridiculously little amount of sleep, then maybe I'm a little bothered by that. And since it's more of a neurological thing, there's not much I can do about it other than to learn how to cope and have certain strategies on how to take myself out of it if I feel like it's making me feel bad. And other than that, I just try to avoid information overload where I can. Now, I also alluded to this in my INFJ video, but I think there's different ways in which you can be highly sensitive. So in the case of my partner, who is an INFP, he is sensitive to bodily sensations like pain and hunger, which I'm not that sensitive to. It's so the way my stomach feels never really affects my mood, whereas this is not the case for him. So whenever you see being hangry as a quality of a highly sensitive person, it applies to him, but it doesn't apply to me. Me, on the other hand, as an INFJ, I'm much more susceptible to moods and other people's energies, or just energies in general. And before I was able to set energetic boundaries, I would really take on other people's moods, and it used to bother me as well, because this could also be overwhelming. Now, I think at this point we should talk about something positive when it comes to being highly sensitive. When I was reading through the list that I'll link down in the description, one of the things was strongly responding to beauty, and that is absolutely the case for me. There's quite a vivid memory that I have of being in the street, and it was a street next to a forest, so we had the forest on one side and a row of houses where we used to live on the other side. And if you follow the road, there was a row of beautiful tall birches, and one day I looked at the birches and they looked so beautiful that I started to cry. And I find it really easy to cry in general, just to cry at an emotional movie, or to cry even listening to music, especially the Lion King soundtrack. So I can really perceive these emotions that are transponded through music or through art, and I can feel them quite intensely. And this is possibly my favorite part of being an HSP, or highly sensitive, and it's the ability to really feel something deeply or intensely, and to have this connection to something beautiful. But of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not just beautiful nature that I consider beautiful. Even a place like Glasgow, you have some parts of Glasgow that look really rundown and really industrial, and it's a particular type of aesthetic that I personally find beautiful. So if you're looking for beauty, you can really find it just about anywhere. With all the talk about emotions, I am also pretty logical and detached, and becoming more aware of emotions and training my ability to tap into emotions definitely made my life easier. And this is something that I really had to teach myself, but this is probably one of the reasons why I don't get as overwhelmed anymore as I used to. Although the likelihood of seeing me cry in public are pretty slim, because I prefer to cry in private. So to summarize, being sensitive used to confuse me, and at times it made me feel like I was suffering and I was questioning why I responded to my environment in such a way. And now I am deeply grateful for being able to sense deeply and feel deeply and enjoy quiet time in nature, and being able to connect to nature, to connect with plants and with animals. And if I think about that, I used to even listen to music while I was walking in the forest. I feel like it's much better the way it is now. I am grateful that I can taste and smell intensely all the tasty foods that I enjoy. And in particular, the smell of roses. There are wild roses that grow along the path that I take into town, and when I would walk to work, I would just take that moment and smell a couple of roses on the way. And smelling it just it was almost a near spiritual experience, because just for that one moment, all I was taking in was the beautiful scent of the rose. But I also adapted to the ways that my skin is sensitive. As I mentioned before, I'm wearing something underneath if I don't want to feel scratchy. And I started to buy merino and cashmere jumpers secondhand off of eBay, just so I can wear something that is really soft on my skin and doesn't bother me. Now, I do wonder, however, how common it actually is for people to be bothered by scratchy wool. Is it just a common thing? Do all people feel bothered by it? Are there people out there who don't feel bothered by itchy wool. If you're one of them, please let me know. I am really curious about just how many people are bothered or not bothered by wearing wool. And as far as tastes go, I tend to cook for myself, and this way I can create very pleasant foods that please my sense of taste. And because I have a sensitive sense of taste, I can balance spices quite well, and I do it intuitively as well. Now, I tend to drink very little these days when it comes to alcohol, but alcohol is something that does dull the senses, and having beers is probably the only thing that enabled me to go out during my time in uni and to go to pubs and to even go to clubs which were really, really loud and not get super overwhelmed. But I think even just the dulling the senses is something that is not desirable to me anymore, and I prefer to take things in as they come. If you are highly sensitive and if you're feeling like it's making your life worse, I hope that you can find ways to cope and uplift yourself and find the positive sides of your sensitivity, because I do think that it can be a great gift. If you are highly sensitive and you're thriving, then I'm very happy for you. But either way, feel free to share your story. If you have any tips on how to cope with feeling overwhelmed, then please do so. Please share that as well. Or perhaps you have partners, friends, or family who are highly sensitive. I think for me, overcoming it, or as much as you can overcome it, was really just to take it step by step, and also gradually improving my ability to cope with stress and the feeling of being overwhelmed. So thank you for watching and have a beautiful day.
Head getting warm.
What?
Your head getting warm.
Yeah.
Just put on your hat. Just put on your hat and say, I'm so sensitive to the heat of the sun that I had to put on a hat.
I'm almost there.
Oh, I see.